Jonathan John Sawyer had never expected to be treated like a burden. In another life, he had moved through the world with surety. His presence had meant something: orders given, missions completed, brothers kept safe. Back then, the uniform he wore seemed to stitch him directly into the fabric of something larger than himself: duty, honor, sacrifice. Now, most days, he wore heavy denim stained by sawdust and motor oil, his left knee stiff from an old injury that throbbed when the weather turned cold. Life was smaller now, stripped down to careful routines and simple hopes. Each morning, he rose before sunrise, fed the old beagle who waited patiently by the door, and crossed the frozen yard to the workshop behind his modest home. Inside, the workshop smelled of cedar and warm metal. Bent tools hung neatly on pegboards. Coffee steamed in a battered thermos by the window. The small heater rattled as it struggled against the bitter Ohio winter. Here, among splintered planks and half-finished repairs, John found a fragile kind of peace. His work was honest, his clients respectful if not always friendly. He made enough to keep the lights on and his daughter Lily in school. That was enough. Or at least, it had been, until he realized he needed more. The idea of expanding the workshop had taken root slowly, like the stubborn weeds that grew through cracks in his driveway. A second workbench, better lighting, maybe even hiring another pair of hands, someone like him, someone overlooked. He imagined giving a younger veteran the same second chance he had given himself. He imagined Lily, proud of the place her father had built. It was these thoughts that carried him to the Midwest Trust Bank branch on a steel gray morning, his best jacket zipped up to the throat, a manila folder tucked beneath his arm. He had spent days preparing the documents: business projections, tax returns, a handwritten cover letter in his neatest cursive. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his right side without thinking, ignoring the sting in his knee. The bank's lobby smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. A row of chairs lined the wall, filled with silent customers scrolling through their phones or tapping their heels against the linoleum floor. John took a number from the cracked plastic dispenser and sat down, balancing the folder carefully on his lap. The branch manager, Bradley Thornton, called his number with the kind of voice reserved for summoning someone to detention rather than to a loan application. John stood, wiped his palms on his jeans, and approached the counter with steady steps. At first, he spoke with quiet confidence, laying out his plan, presenting the folder with hands that only shook a little from the cold. He had done everything right. No debt, no criminal record, good credit. His application was solid, he thought. Bradley barely glanced at the papers. His lips curled into a smirk. "You were in the military," he said, loudly enough that heads turned. John nodded, keeping his back straight. Bradley leaned forward, as if sharing a joke that everyone else was in on. "Yeah, well, we don't exactly consider that real employment around here. Playing soldier doesn't mean you know anything about running a business." A sharp heat rose in John's chest. Around him, the rustle of movement, the subtle shifting of people trying to look busy, to look anywhere but at him, filled the room. A mother tightened her grip on her child's hand. An elderly man coughed into his fist and stared down at his shoes. No one spoke. No one intervened. Bradley chuckled as he shoved the folder back across the counter with two fingers, as if it were something distasteful. "We don't give handouts just because someone wore a uniform once. Come back when you have actual work experience." The words hit harder than John expected. Harder than G***fire, harder than explosions, harder than the long nights he had spent bleeding and broken halfway around the world. He picked up his folder, the edges now bent and smudged, and straightened as much as his worn body allowed. He said nothing. Not because he couldn't. Because he knew that any response would only feed the spectacle. Instead, John turned and walked slowly across the lobby, past the indifferent stares, past the silent judgment. His boots made soft, hollow sounds against the polished floor. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss, letting in a gust of icy air that stung his cheeks. Outside, the cold felt cleaner somehow. The winter sky pressed low, thick with snow that had not yet fallen. John stood on the concrete steps, breathing deep, steadying himself against the railing with one scarred hand. His other hand clenched the folder until the edges cut into his palm. Inside, through the glass, he saw Bradley laughing with a coworker, their shoulders shaking with cruel amusement. John swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth and stepped forward into the parking lot, the wind slicing through his jacket like needles. The dream he had carried, the small hope of growing something meaningful, seemed to flicker and gutter like a candle in a storm. He made it halfway across the lot before he noticed a figure leaning casually against the side of a battered sedan. The man looked to be in his 70s, dressed in a plain, well-pressed suit that seemed at odds with the car he leaned on. A worn leather satchel hung from one shoulder, and his hands were tucked into the pockets of his coat. His face was deeply lined, his hair a shock of white against the dark collar. John met the stranger's gaze, instinctively assessing him the way he had been trained to do. There was no threat there, only a calm, steady watchfulness. As John passed by, the man shifted slightly, producing a small, plain business card from his coat. He held it out without a word, as casual and natural as passing a note in church. John hesitated, then accepted it. No name. No title. Just a phone number. And, in the center, a small insignia, a hawk, wings spread wide, talons extended. Before John could ask anything, the man pushed off the car and walked away, his steps measured and unhurried, disappearing around the corner as if swallowed by the winter mist. John stared at the card in his hand, the wind snapping at its edges. For the first time that day, something stirred inside him, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. He tucked the card carefully into the pocket over his heart and headed home, not yet knowing how profoundly his life was about to change. The cold evening wrapped itself around John like a heavy, familiar cloak as he drove home, the truck's heater rattling against the freezing wind. Lily would already be home from school, sitting cross-legged on the worn couch with her math book open, the television playing quietly in the background. The thought steadied him, as it always did. His daughter was the anchor that kept him steady in waters that too often threatened to pull him under. But that night, the house seemed colder somehow. The walls thinner. The mailbox had been stuffed with more than the usual junk, 3 envelopes bearing serious warnings, late utilities, overdue mortgage, and a final notice from the insurance company. John placed them neatly on the kitchen table and turned away without opening them. He had learned, over time, that the weight of unopened trouble was lighter than the certainty inside. Lily padded into the room, her socked feet silent on the worn linoleum. "How was your day, Dad?" she asked, her voice too bright, too carefully casual. He smiled, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. Same old," he said, ruffling her hair. "What about you?" She hesitated just a second too long before answering. "Okay. Just school stuff." She shrugged, but her eyes slid away from his, lingering on the unopened envelopes. John knew better than to press. Children learned quickly to carry what they shouldn't have to. Lily, at 11, carried too much already. They ate dinner together, macaroni from a box, dressed up with leftover chicken, and Lily chattered about her piano practice and a history project. John listened, laughing in all the right places, asking questions when he was supposed to. But part of him stayed distant, like a man watching his own life through glass. Later, when Lily was tucked in and the house had settled into the kind of deep quiet that only the coldest nights bring, John pulled the business card from his pocket. The hawk insignia caught the weak light from the table lamp, sharp and certain. No name. No promise. Just a number. For a long while he simply sat there, card in one hand, the other wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. He thought about pride. About dignity. About the way the bank manager's words had cut deeper than any wound he'd taken in uniform. He thought about Lily, overhearing the whispers, the rumors that would bloom like weeds in small-town soil. And he thought about the faces that had turned away inside the bank, the silent witnesses who said nothing, who would say nothing tomorrow, or the next day, or the next. In the end, it wasn't pride that made him reach for the phone. It was survival. His fingers dialed the number before his mind could stop them. The line connected after a single ring. A voice answered, formal and composed, as if expecting his call. "Name," it said. "John Sawyer," he replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. There was the faint sound of typing on a keyboard. "Describe the incident." John hesitated, then found himself recounting the scene in the bank, the humiliation, the smirks, the way his past had been dismissed like trash swept into the gutter. He spoke simply, factually, leaving out the parts that hurt too much to say aloud. The voice on the other end listened without interruption. When John finished, there was a brief pause, filled only by the faint crackle of the line. "Be at the bank at 8 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning," the voice said finally. "And bring your daughter." John blinked, caught off guard. "Why?" he asked. But the line had already gone dead. The card slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the table like a falling leaf. Sleep came slowly that night, broken into shallow patches. Dreams of distant G***fire and heavy boots haunted him again. He woke long before dawn, staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling the weight of decisions he barely understood. By 6, he had packed Lily's backpack with extra clothes and a thermos of hot cocoa. She looked at him with wide, questioning eyes but said nothing as he bundled her into the truck, the engine growling to life in the frozen morning air. They drove in silence through streets still cloaked in darkness. Porch lights glowed faintly against the heavy sky. Christmas decorations blinked weakly from a few yards, their colors muted by the frost. As they turned onto Main Street, John's stomach tightened. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But as they crested the hill, he saw them clearly. Parked in formation along the curb were a line of military vehicles, dark green Humvees, the kind he hadn't seen since his last tour overseas. Their engines idled low and steady, sending up thin streams of exhaust into the icy air. Beside them, rows of motorcycles gleamed under the streetlights, their chrome and steel shining even in the weak light. Riders in leather jackets stood silently beside their bikes, their faces solemn. At the center of it all, framed against the glass facade of Midwest Trust Bank, stood a group of uniformed men and women. Veterans. Active duty officers. Shoulders squared, boots polished to mirror brightness, hands clasped behind their backs. They stood not as individuals, but as one body, one force. John pulled the truck over, his heart hammering against his ribs. People were beginning to gather along the sidewalks, residents in coats and scarves, drawn by the quiet thunder of assembled power. Some carried phones, already recording. Some simply stood, faces pale with awe. Lily craned her neck, her breath fogging the window. "Dad," she whispered. "Is this for us?" John opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He reached across and gently squeezed her hand. Outside, the morning continued to break slowly across Bloomfield, painting everything in a pale, reverent gold. And John Sawyer, standing on the edge of something he could not yet name, realized for the first time in a very long while. He was not alone. John opened the truck door, the hinges creaking in the frozen air. For a moment, he simply stood there, boots crunching on the frostbitten asphalt, as the full weight of the scene before him sank in. The veterans remained still, their presence silent but deafening, like the slow toll of a distant bell. Across the street, townsfolk crowded the sidewalks, faces half hidden by scarves and hats, eyes wide. Some of them John recognized, customers from past jobs, teachers from Lily's school, even the clerk from the grocery store who had once ignored him when he struggled to carry his bags. Now they watched, their breath-forming little clouds, their hands stuffed into pockets, not knowing what to do with themselves. The glass doors of Midwest Trust Bank quivered slightly as they swung open. Bradley Thornton stepped out onto the front steps, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. His face was a mixture of confusion and irritation, the same entitled expression he had worn the day before when dismissing John like so much dirt tracked in from the street. Bradley glanced at the crowd, then at the line of soldiers and riders. He hesitated, as if calculating how best to handle the situation, how to save face. His arrogance wavered as he spotted the man who now approached him. Major General Thomas Whitaker. The general's medals caught the morning light, flashing like small suns against the deep green of his dress uniform. His posture was impossibly straight despite the years etched into his face. Every step he took across the bank's front lot sounded like a drumbeat, measured and deliberate. He stopped just a few feet from Bradley, allowing the silence to stretch taut. Bradley opened his mouth, then closed it again. Across the street, someone fumbled with a video camera, the red recording light blinking steadily. Whitaker turned his head slightly, scanning the assembled crowd, before speaking, his voice strong, clear, carrying easily over the frozen air. "Yesterday," he said, "one of this town's own was humiliated on these very steps." The words sliced through the tension like a blade. Murmurs stirred among the townspeople. Jonathan Sawyer, the general continued, a man who wore the uniform of the United States Army for 12 years. A man who bled on foreign soil, who saved lives without thought of his own. A man who came here in good faith, seeking only the chance to grow something better for his family. John shifted, the sudden, intense focus of so many eyes setting his skin on edge. Lily squeezed his hand, anchoring him. The general gestured sharply toward the bank's front door. And instead of respect, he was met with mockery. Bradley's jaw clenched. Behind him, the glass walls of the bank reflected the image of the gathered veterans like a judgment. Whitaker stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, but it somehow seemed even more powerful. Security footage from this location, obtained through public record request, has been shared with the Office of Veteran Affairs and several advocacy groups. It has been viewed by state officials, by military leadership, and as of this morning, by national media. He turned to the crowd. "For those who did not see, you soon will." An assistant stepped forward, setting up a portable screen and projector. Within moments, the footage flickered to life, John standing humbly at the counter, the folder in his hands, Bradley's sneer unmistakable. His words were captured clearly, every cutting insult, every dismissive gesture. There was no way to deny it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman near the front covered her mouth with her glove. Someone muttered a sharp curse under their breath. John felt his cheeks burn all over again, but he refused to look away. He would not flinch from the truth of what had been done to him. The video ended. The screen went black. Major General Whitaker turned back to Bradley. "You mocked a man better than yourself," he said, voice thick with restrained anger. "And you forgot one very important thing: we do not leave our own behind." The silence that followed was so deep it seemed to ring inside John's ears. Bradley floundered, trying to find words, but none came. His power, so absolute inside the polished walls of his office, had melted away under the bright, merciless morning. John realized he was shaking slightly. Not from fear. From something else. From the feeling of being seen. Of being valued. Whitaker turned then, facing John directly for the first time. His face softened, not pity, but profound respect. The general drew something from his coat, a plaque of deep, polished wood, engraved with gold lettering. For Jonathan Sawyer, it read, "In gratitude for service, sacrifice, and the strength to endure." The general extended it toward him with both hands, the way one might offer a sword to a knight. John accepted it, the weight surprising him, grounding him. Then Whitaker reached into his pocket and pressed a small coin into John's hand. A challenge coin, etched with an eagle and the words, "Strength through honor." The kind of token given only for deeds that mattered, for courage that didn't make headlines but changed lives. John closed his fingers around it, the metal warm from the general's hand. He glanced down and saw Lily looking up at him, her face full of something new. Not pity. Not sadness. Pride. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause, hesitant at first, then building into something that filled the frozen air like the roar of distant artillery, but this time, it was not destruction it heralded. It was justice. It was honor finding its way home. John bowed his head slightly, overwhelmed. He had not asked for this. He had only tried to live. But kindness, it seemed, had a longer reach than cruelty. It circled back. It always did. The sun rose higher as the crowd began to disperse, the veterans and writers forming protective circles around John and Lily, speaking quietly among themselves. Some townspeople lingered on the sidewalks, shuffling awkwardly, not quite ready to face the shame that had settled like frost over their small community. John stood still, the plaque heavy in one hand, the challenge coin still clutched tightly in the other. The warmth of the metal seemed to steady him, like the steady thrum of drums he remembered from old military ceremonies, a heartbeat of honor against the cold. Lily held onto his coat sleeve, her small hand anchoring him to this moment, this unexpected turn in a life that had seemed so determined to fade into quiet defeat. From the line of veterans, a woman in civilian clothes stepped forward. Her hair was tucked beneath a knit cap, but her bearing was unmistakable, proud, disciplined, resilient. She introduced herself simply, offering a firm handshake and a badge clipped to her belt. Rachel Moreno, Director of Outreach for the National Heroes Foundation. In the soft murmur of the gathering, her words carried weight. "Mr. Sawyer," she said, "the foundation would like to offer you a grant to expand your business. Full funding, equipment, supplies, even space rental if needed. We believe in building futures for those who built ours." John opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. Gratitude rose in his chest like a tide, almost too heavy to bear. Rachel handed him an official envelope. Thick paper, gold seal. Real. But she wasn't done. "There are also several private firms," she added, "who saw the footage. They want to contract with veteran-owned businesses for restoration and construction projects." She smiled, and for the first time in a long while, John believed that maybe, just maybe, the world still had space for the good he wanted to build. Lily squeezed his hand tighter, sensing the shift, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. The weeks that followed moved like a flood. John's workshop, once a lonely shack behind their home, began to hum with new life. Deliveries of fresh lumber, industrial tools, and shiny equipment arrived daily. Neighbors who had once looked away now honked as they drove by, waving sheepishly. Some even stopped to ask about work. True to his original dream, John hired fellow veterans first, men and women who wore their scars both visible and invisible, who knew the language of quiet resilience without needing to say much at all. They laughed together over bent nails and stubborn screws, and the laughter sounded like the beginning of something strong. He called it Sawyer Veterans Construction. The name stood proudly on a new hand-painted sign, simple and honest, much like the man himself. The local newspaper ran a story on the business's opening day, and a photographer captured John and Lily standing side by side, her arms wrapped around his waist, both of them smiling at something unseen just beyond the camera. At school, the whispers around Lily slowly faded. The girl who once overheard cruel rumors about her father now walked the halls a little taller, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a battered piano book peeking out the side. John reinstated her piano lessons without a second thought. Watching her small fingers dance across the keys in their living room, hearing the tentative melodies grow stronger, became the sweetest sound he knew. They weren't rich. They weren't famous. But they were building a life that mattered, piece by careful piece. And so it was that on Veterans Day, just 6 months later, Bloomfield gathered again. This time, they came willingly. Under a clear blue sky, the town's officials, the veterans, the children with small American flags in hand, stood together around the Memorial Park at the heart of Main Street. John wore a clean work jacket and jeans still dusted with sawdust from the morning's projects. He wasn't one for speeches, but they had asked, and he had agreed, because some moments mattered more than his discomfort. He stood behind the simple podium, clearing his throat once before beginning. "We don't ask for pity," he said, his voice steady and low. "We don't ask for special treatment. We ask only for the chance to stand equally. To live honorably. To serve again, not through war, but through work, through kindness, through community." The words hung in the crisp air like breath itself, real, tangible. Beside the old war monument, John and Lily planted a young oak tree together, their hands pressing cold earth around its roots. A small wooden sign was staked beside it. "New life grows from old roots," it read. The crowd watched in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward but reverent, as if they understood, finally, that this wasn't just about one man. It was about all the unseen battles fought every day in small houses and quiet streets, by people who simply refused to give up. After the ceremony, Lily sat cross-legged beneath the new oak, her piano book open on her lap, her fingers mimicking silent chords in the chilly air. John sat beside her, resting his back against the young trunk, feeling its strength, its promise. The leaves above them stirred gently in the November wind, whispering promises into the open sky. And for the first time in what felt like forever, John allowed himself to believe that kindness, real, patient, undeserved kindness, could grow roots deeper than bitterness. Kindness without question is enough. It always has been. It always will be.